Whilst there have been calls in this place for Alex Salmond to cease broadcasting on Russia Today, negotiations have obviously been happening in the background, and I can confirm that he has suspended broadcasting on Russia Today. But we must prepare for the worst. And I would ask the Prime Minister what strategy is he bringing forward to increase the capacity of North Sea oil and gas so that we can support ourselves and EU member states and protect our people from a further increase in the cost of living?
Mr. Speaker, I must say I disagree profoundly with what he has had to say about negotiating now. I don't think that option is open to us. We must do our best to support and protect the people of Ukraine and working with our international friends and allies to constrict what Vladimir Putin can do. And on his point about Russia Today, Mr. Speaker, I simply observe that the former leader of the Scottish Nationalist Party is his leader. Sorry, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. His leader. I understand the pleas he entered in defence and mitigation. They don't seem to cut much ice with me.
Sir Graham Brady.
I wasn't standing.
Steve Crabb is the name.
Mr. Speaker, I strongly welcome the further set of sanctions announced by the Prime Minister this evening, and we look forward to further steps being taken in the days ahead and not being held back by perhaps some of the slower-moving members of the alliance in Europe. But does the Prime Minister agree with me that if sanctions are really to bite on Putin and his gangster government, then inevitably it will mean cost and inconvenience to UK economic interests, but that cost and inconvenience will be as nothing compared to what the people of Ukraine are going through, and we stand with them this evening?
Yes, I'm afraid my honourable friend is right. It will mean cost. It will mean inconvenience. It will mean difficulty for us in the UK. But that will be a price worth paying, Mr. Speaker, for defeating the objectives of Vladimir Putin and showing that aggression does not pay.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Could I just follow up on the question from the honourable member for the Isle of Wight about the Combating Kleptocracy cell in the National Crime Agency, and just seek from the Prime Minister a view whether additional powers will be required for the National Crime Agency and additional resources for them to do their work.
I thank her very much. They will, of course, they have plenty of existing statute, but the additional powers that they will have, amongst other things, will be the ability to peel back the facade of ownership, which I think will be extremely valuable.
Jonathan Ginocchia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst this terrible, appalling incident is, of course, directly the cause of Russia, I think it's appropriate that we also recognise that over the last 14 years, the UK, the EU, the US collectively have not been attentive to Russia in the way that we should. Can my right honourable friend now say that whatever happened in the past, moving forward, we are not going to let Russia fall between our fingers again?
Mr. Speaker, I think the lesson of 2014 is that the whole of the West failed to respond in the way that we should. And when a sovereign country was invaded and part of that country was occupied, I'm afraid it was quite wrong that we tried to manage the situation with the various diplomatic processes that we did, which in the end produced absolutely nothing except finally this catastrophic invasion today. We have to a bitter lesson, Mr. Speaker, about how to deal with Vladimir Putin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree with the Prime Minister that it seems like the curtain has now come down on that era that began in 1989, and we've lived in an era of change since then. This now feels like a change of era. In this new era, the permissive environment that we created for the Kremlin's quartermasters to live, to invest, and to party in London, sometimes with the Prime Minister himself, that must now come to an end. So let me ask the Prime Minister this. Will he undertake to ensure that every visa issued to a Russian dual national is now reviewed, and where proximity to President Putin is proven, that citizenship should be stripped away?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, we are doing that, though I think it is. I just think it's worth the House remembering the point that I made the other day. Not every Russian is a bad person, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome the package of sanctions the Prime Minister has set out? And whilst I understand why it's not been possible to suspend Russia from the SWIFT payment system at this stage, can I ask what work we're doing with our European allies to offer them reassurance so that eventually we can get to a position when they can be suspended, because that is by far and away the biggest thing that will isolate the Russian economy.
My honourable friend is spot on. The biggest thing would be if everybody stopped taking Russian hydrocarbons. But SWIFT is extremely important, and it's a Belgian company, as I'm sure the House knows. We're raising it. We're trying to make progress with our friends, but for obvious reasons, it has to be done in unison.
Stuart M. MacDonald.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker. This morning I spoke with friends in Kyiv who were leaving the country with their family, their children, and we've all seen the scenes from the capital of cars trying to get out. So I send my deepest thanks to the embassy team there who are doing all they can to support people. But can I ask the Prime Minister about two areas of support for Ukraine: economic support and continuing support for defensive capability? Will both of those areas of support intensify, and can he assure the House, I see the Foreign Secretary telling me so, but can he assure the House that the government will continue the deepest possible conversations with the government in Ukraine to ensure that no matter the assault that comes to it from Vladimir Putin, we will be supporting them in a deeply meaningful sense?
Yes, on that last point, the answer is certainly yes, Mr. Speaker. And just for instance, the other day I was looking at two British minesweepers being refitted in Rosyth, as I'm sure he knows, which are due to go to Ukraine. The question will be access, Mr. Speaker. That's what it all depends on.
Sir Robert Butland.
Mr. Speaker, it's crystal clear from this act of naked aggression that Putin doesn't seek Finlandisation on his borders. He seeks at best to recreate a Belarus in the south, or at worst to dismember the sovereign state of Ukraine. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that that does mean that we need to build upon the outcome of our integrated defence review? We do need to think differently about Eastern Europe from the past. And then at home, with his announcement on bringing forward economic crime measures, it seems that there is a consensus in this House that could allow us to bring forward emergency legislation to bring those important measures to really hit those people hard and hit them now.
Speaker, I think that is clearly the will of the House, and it is the will of the government, and that's why we'll be taking those important measures, bringing them forward on Monday.
Shanara Ali.
Mr. Speaker, my thoughts are with the Ukrainian people at this time. And while I welcome the sanctions the Prime Minister's announced today, can he update the House on whether he plans to sanction the major state-owned Russian banks such as Sberbank and Gazprom Bank and the non-state bank Alpha Bank? Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Ukrainian POW chapel at Lockerbie in my constituency is a focal point for the Ukrainian diaspora in Scotland, and prayers are being said there for their fellow countrymen. But what Ukrainians in the UK have identified, being grateful for the military support that has already been forthcoming, is that there is an immediate need for medical battlefield supplies, for warm clothing for troops and for camouflage gear. And can my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, assure the House that they will be forthcoming?
I thank my right honourable friend very much. He raises a very important issue, and we are working on exactly those supplies right now.
Van Jones.
I thank the Prime Minister for his statement, and very much welcome the sanctions that is announced today. But can you give an assurance that the sanctions that are going to target individuals will also target relatives and connected parties? And like the Honourable Right Member for Swindon, he mentioned the Economic Crime Bill. We've got the review of the Official Secrets Act and the Foreign Registration Act. Why can't we bring them forward and do them now? They would get huge support, and we've been waiting for some of these for nearly 2 years.
Mr. Speaker, I can tell him that we will certainly be making sure that we are able to sanction and do sanction relatives and other interested parties, and there'll be a rolling programme of intensifying sanctions.
Crispin Blunt.
Having been one of the officials that accompanied the then Defence Secretary to both Moscow and Kiev in 1993, I'm in no doubt that the signatories of the United States and the United Kingdom on the Budapest Memorandum gave Ukraine the confidence to give up its nuclear deterrent. Will my right honourable friend support the United States, to whatever extent it is prepared to go, to stand alongside the United States in giving whatever military support it's prepared to do so to Ukraine?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right to remind the House of the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which had exactly that effect and created exactly that obligation on us as one of the signatories.
Very Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister will be aware that we are, on this side of the House, very keen on these sanctions. Although, does he share with me the worry that the record of driving out dictators and demagogues with these sanctions isn't always that successful? Does he share my concern that if we've read what Putin has been saying these last few hours, here's a man that might not stop at Ukraine. He might go into a NATO country. And are we playing that scenario? Because many of us think that might be the next step.
The right honourable gentleman is absolutely right to raise that appalling possibility, and it is vital that we reaffirm again that under Article 5 of the NATO Treaty we stand foursquare behind every one of our NATO allies and will come to their defence.
Ian Duncan-Smith.
Speaker, can I say to my right honourable friend that with Ukrainian men and women dying to fight against the Russians for their freedom today, those who are calling for negotiation at this point can only please that rambling wreck of a neo-Nazi sitting in the Kremlin, and they should be shunned. Secondly, can I just say to my honourable friend today, the ambassador from Ukraine asked desperately whether NATO would look at a no-fly zone. I know it's a difficult choice, but could my right honourable friend step to the dispatch box and make it clear that in this particular case he rules nothing out?
Mr. Speaker, I know that my right honourable friend is a great military expert, and he will understand. And I understand the attractions of the no-fly zone. I remember the no-fly zone that was created in 1991, as I recall, in northern Iraq. The situation here is very different. We would face the risk of having to shoot down Russian planes, Mr. Speaker, and that is something that I think the House would want to contemplate with caution.
Lord Russell Moyle.
Speaker, in locking out Russian state money, I hope the Prime Minister can give me reassurance that that will include our overseas territories and dependencies that must be included in this. And I note that there are, Mr. Speaker, protests in a number of Russian cities across Russia at the moment, and celebrities in Russia have been speaking out. I do hope that we will be offering all the support that we can to those people who are likely to be shunned by the fascist imperialist Putin regime.
Yes, and can I say, Mr. Speaker, that one of the reasons why I want to keep our fantastic British Embassy staff in Moscow, even though the temptation is there simply to sunder diplomatic relations with Putin, I want to keep them there to support groups such as the ones he mentions.
Bob Stewart.
Mr. Speaker, I've given evidence at 4 war crimes trials. It was genocide and crimes against humanity the people were charged with. Could I ask my right honourable friend and the House to agree with me that any Russian who kills a Ukrainian must remember that one day they may well be brought to court for crimes against humanity or genocide?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and not just any Russian combatant, Mr. Speaker, but anyone who sends a Russian into battle to kill innocent Ukrainians.
Bill Esterson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. President Zelensky has called for the toughest possible sanctions. For them to be the toughest possible, that must mean immediate. So, in his statement, he talked about in the next session for the economic measures, including on Companies House and on the Register of Overseas Property Ownership. But in answer to the Right Honourable Member for Swindon, he said something about bringing forward on Monday. Which of these is it? And if it is Monday, will it have the same effect as is required for that immediate action?
We'll be bringing it forward on Monday, Mr. Speaker, and we want to have, I hope, and I'm grateful for the support of the opposition, we want immediately to start cracking down on these individuals.
Jesse Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The whole House will welcome the enhanced package of sanctions that the Prime Minister has announced today. But can I raise the question of football, much beloved to Russian hearts, and in particular issues of ownership, of property and of shareholdings, and of the future participation of Russian clubs in international matches?
He's right. My right honourable friend is completely right. The Russians attach a great deal of sentimental importance to football, and they hope to have the UEFA Championship final in St. Petersburg. I cannot for the life of me see how that can currently go ahead.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
Putin's war on Ukraine is brutal, illegal and a calculated attack on peace and stability in Europe. Plaid Cymru fully supports the actions and sanctions announced today. Putin, his cronies and their personal fortunes must pay for their actions. On a visit to Ukraine, Plaid Cymru leaders spoke to Ukrainian soldiers, government officials and organisations, admiring Ukrainian people for their strength and their resilience, and they are now in harm's way. With Poland organising medical assistance and Slovakia opening its borders to refugees, will his government mobilise and resource a global effort to support and aid people fleeing this horrific conflict?
Again, Mr. Speaker, I thank her very much for her support and her resolve, and I want to assure her that we're, of course, working with our international friends to prepare for a humanitarian crisis.
Deanna Davison.
Speaker, earlier this afternoon I had the opportunity to speak to on a Zoom call with a number of Ukrainian MPs who were all calling for additional support. One of the key things they were discussing is concerns that their communications networks may get shut down. So can I urge the Prime Minister to ensure we're doing all we can to provide things like satellite phones to make sure they can still communicate, not just internally, but with us here in the UK too?
Mr. Speaker, she's absolutely right. The honourable, my honourable friend is absolutely right. There is a threat to communications already, and we're observing it in the contacts that we're having with people in Ukraine. Satellite phones certainly are an option, and we'll be looking at that.
Sarah Owen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've rightly heard a lot about tougher trade sanctions today, but nothing about ridding Russian state influence from our democracy. Will the Prime Minister commit to investigating all political donations received from people with links to Putin? And will his government finally bring forward measures to clean up the corrupt Russian money that for far too long has been laundered in the UK?
So, Mr. Speaker, all political donations are properly registered and monitored, and I can tell her that we are putting forward and progressively over the last few days and weeks and today the biggest ever package to crack down on dirty Russian money, not just from Russia but from anywhere.
Steve Baker.
Speaker, I welcome these sanctions today. My right honourable friend has been crystal clear that all Europe needs to end dependence on Russian oil and gas. Could he tell us a little bit more about how he intends to see that comes to pass?
Thank you. I thank my right honourable friend. The key thing is to get people, first of all, to recognise the scale of their dependency, as in any addiction. And that's what we're doing, and the UK government's been making that point the whole time to our friends, because it's got worse since 2014. But what we're also doing is helping countries, for instance in the Baltic states, to go further and faster with renewable technology.
Daniel Zeichner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think everyone knows that the Ukraine is a major producer of grain, and unfortunately, because of these awful events, there are likely to be consequences for many countries, including our own. Could I ask the Prime Minister to look again at our food security proposals and make sure that we are secure ourselves and not reliant so much as we have been in the past?
Yeah, he's absolutely right, and food security is an important consideration. And one of the many things that our fantastic Ukrainian community have done in the last few years is help us in that very sector.
Andrew Bridgen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that Western Europe's ongoing reliance on Russian oil and gas has been a major factor in emboldening President Putin in the mistaken belief that he can invade his peaceful neighbour with relative impunity? And in the UK, shouldn't we refocus our energy policy on maximising the use of our own natural resources, looking again at fracking while we invest in low-carbon alternatives?
Yes, the honourable gentleman is totally right. My honourable friend is totally right when he talks about the excessive dependence on hydrocarbons. We're moving away from it in this country. I do think there is a merit, and I think he and I might be in agreement on this, there is a merit in a transitional phase in continuing with the use of hydrocarbons in this country rather than pointlessly importing them from abroad.
Emma Lewell-Butt.
Mr. Speaker, Putin's imperial bloodlust won't stop at Ukraine. We're rightly focused on sanctions, military and humanitarian support and our commitment to Ukrainian freedom. But the Prime Minister knows there's been a phenomenal increase in Russian submarine activity over the last 20 years. Our undersea cables carry more than 95% of all Western military, diplomatic, commercial, financial and personal communications. The consequences of these cables being weaponised is terrifying. Can he assure me that countering this threat is part of our ongoing dialogue with allies?
She's absolutely right, and there is a continual struggle going on beneath the surface of the sea, as she knows, between submarines that are out to sever cables and those of us who are trying to make sure that those links are maintained.
Sir Charles Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following on from my right honourable and gallant friend's question about war crimes, I suspect those crimes are already being committed by Russian soldiers against their Slavic brothers and sisters. Can the Prime Minister join with his NATO heads of state setting out at an early stage how war crimes will be prosecuted, so all Russian soldiers, field officers, generals and, of course, as the Prime Minister said, politicians are brutally aware of where they will end up in a few years' time?
Yeah, very good. He is absolutely right, and I thank him very much, my honourable friend. That's why we're working on setting up a particular international war crimes tribunal for those involved in war crimes in the Ukraine theatre.
Well, as being incredibly ruthless, President Putin is also incredibly rich, with one assessment saying that his personal wealth is up to $200 billion. So can the Prime Minister ensure that President Putin himself pays a heavy price by targeting his own cash and assets?
Yes, absolutely, Mr. Speaker, and not just him, but as the House has heard over the last few days, as many of his immediate cronies and family as we can hit.
Sakib Bhatti.
Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister for all that he's done. Just before the statement, I spoke to some of the Ukrainian protesters who are outside. One of them was holding back tears as she spoke about her mother in a cellar as her house is surrounded by Ukrainian tanks. So any member of this House who's asking for a negotiated settlement needs to go and speak to them, because all they want is to live their lives as free and peaceful people. Will the Prime Minister confirm to the people of Ukraine that he will do everything he can to end the tyranny of Putin, and that he will do everything he can to make sure that they live as a peaceful and free people?
Yes, I certainly can confirm that, Mr. Speaker. And what I can also say is that I believe by making this invasion, I think that President Putin has done more than anybody else to bring his regime to an end. because I think in the end he will pay a huge price for what he has done, and I know that this House will want to make it so.
Colin Bishwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome and support the measures outlined by the Prime Minister today? Putin is a gangster and a despot who has been trying to undermine and subvert democracy across the world for years. One of the tools that he uses is through political donations to political parties, including in this country. Will the Prime Minister commit today to ridding the democracy in London from to ridding Russian money out of democracy in this country?
Yes, of course, Mr. Speaker.
Blake Drummond.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland today triggered Article 4 of the North Atlantic Treaty, and I think I heard that we are going to be joining in those discussions. But can my right honourable friend assure our NATO allies in Eastern Europe that we stand firmly with them, particularly the Baltic states that have significant Russian populations?
I thank her very much. She's completely right, and that's why one of the first things we did was to strengthen our presence in Estonia in the way that I've described, and our Canadian friends are strengthening their presence in Latvia, and we will make sure that we give the Baltic states in particular, who seceded from the Soviet Union, who became free and independent at that amazing moment, give them all the security that they deserve.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's overwhelming evidence that Russian state actors have been involved in trying to disrupt and destabilise Western democracies using social media platforms such as Facebook. So what is the government doing to ensure that this isn't used in these events?
Mr. Speaker, as I said, I think in an answer a couple of days ago, we've got no evidence of disruption of UK elections or electoral events as a result of Russian activity, but the Online Harms Bill is there to provide such protections.
Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for his statement, and indeed thank the Leader of Her Majesty's Opposition for his supportive and moving words. But can I also reinforce the point made by my honourable friend for Huntingdon? Why has it come to this pass? How has the West in general, and the United Kingdom in particular, been so asleep at the switch for such a long period of time? And I commend the Defence and Security Review, but isn't it now time to ask what the permanent and impartial machinery of our government does, failing to provide ministers with consistent advice about the strategic threats that our country faces?
Mr. Speaker, I think there are all sorts of reasons for the failure of the West to take sufficient account of the threat of Vladimir Putin since 2014, but the two biggest are oil and gas.
Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, with cyber attacks and falsehoods, Russia is peddling lies today. Now, observers on the ground are crucial to relay the truth. Now, in recent weeks, the UK has withdrawn its team from the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission because staff safety is key. But can the Prime Minister look again to support international efforts like this to get to the facts and counter Russian disinformation?
I thank the MMR teams. They're wonderful. I've met them, and they do a fantastic job. I'm sorry that they've had to be withdrawn for the duty of care reasons that he rightly alludes to, and we will keep it under constant review.
Liam Fox.
The 1994 Budapest Memorandum saw Ukraine give up its nuclear weapons in return for a security guarantee not only signed by Britain and the United States, but by Russia. Does my right honourable friend believe that Ukraine would have been invaded had it retained its nuclear weapons? And what does it say about the value of a Russian signature on any international agreement?
Well, it's clear that President Putin sets no store by international law, whatever, and that is just one of the legal obligations that he has torn up.
Kirsty Black.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, we awoke this morning to images of innocent families cowering in tube stations. We know the Putin regime's propensity for repression and tyranny, particularly when it comes to minorities. Will the Prime Minister ensure that humanitarian aid is delivered not just in concert with other international partners, but also with third sector organisations?
Yes, of course. The third sector plays an invaluable role.
Graham Stewart.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the Prime Minister's statement and his specifically ruling out the threat of creeping normalisation, because this House should be under no doubt that Putin is well prepared. He has hundreds of billions of foreign currency reserves. He has a military that has been tested. And will the Prime Minister do everything he can to convert the current intent into frameworks that cement our intent over time, because he is betting on the fact that it won't be?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, because the plan that the G7 have agreed on and our friends and partners have agreed on is that Putin must fail. Putin must not succeed in this venture. But we've got to put in place all the steps we need to take, diplomatically, economically, and yes, militarily, in order to ensure that that is the case. And that's what we're doing.
Very good.
The Prime Minister is right to have set out the most stringent possible set of sanctions against the government of Russia. Can he outline for the House what the implications will also be for cooperation at the International Space Station?
I thank him. I thank him very much. We will have to see what further downstream effects there are on collaboration of all kinds. I must say that hitherto I have been broadly in favour of continuing artistic and scientific collaboration, but in the current circumstances it's hard to see how even those can continue as normal.
Sir John Hayes.
Speaker, the mix of practice and principle is the test of democratic politics, exemplified at its best when this House comes together in common cause. The test of leadership is the mix of vision and will, and the Prime Minister is to be commended for his willful, clear-sighted determination. So will he now reassure the House that he's in close touch with those countries close to Ukraine, where nerves will be frayed, and that will he send them an urgent message that this House and this nation will always stand alongside and behind free nations?
He's the right honourable gentleman, as so often, is precisely right, and that's why, together with my right honourable friends, the Defence Secretary, the Foreign Secretary, we've been visiting Poland, Romania, the Balts, all those who are now feeling such deep unease at what is happening.
Alistair Carmichael.
Mr. Speaker, as we speak, the Softcom Flot tanker NS Challenger is berthed at Sullomvo in Shetland, taking on a load of crude oil for export. Softcom Flot, as the Prime Minister may know, is a company owned and operated by the Russian government. My constituents, Mr. Speaker, are asking me why they should be loading oil onto a Russian tanker while Russian troops are marching into the Ukraine. I cannot think of any good answer to give them. So, can the Prime Minister tell me, will anything that he has announced today ensure that that will not happen again in the future?
Well, I can tell him, I thank him very much, and I will of course, immediately investigate what is happening with the Softcom Flot oil tanker. But the result of the measures that the House passed the other day is that we can now target any entity, any company that has any relation with the Russian state. So we have that power.
Tim Bolton.
Speaker, tyrants and megalomaniacs invade countries because they think they can get away with it. And the way to deal with bullies is to stand up with them. So I'm sure he will acknowledge that the way the West responds to this aggression will have repercussions not just for Russia and Ukraine, but for other bullies like China as well. And will he be mindful of the need to show support to Russia's smaller southerly neighbours, especially Georgia and Armenia, who feel particularly vulnerable at this time?
Yeah.
Yes, I thank him. He's right, because the read across, the knock on, is obvious for Georgia and Armenia. What he proposes to create, Putin, is a new sphere of influence, a new Yalta, in which those countries come behind his new Iron Curtain.
Stephen Wakefield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a member of this House with Ukrainian heritage, this issue particularly troubles me. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for his tone of his statement and the resolute and swift action that he's proposing in tackling Russia, but the resolute and swift support he's offering to the people of Ukraine. During his speech, he also highlighted the issues of the cost of living and the rise of fuel prices. Could he also touch on what further action the government will take in order to address that issue?
I thank him very much, and I think he's quite right, because I think people across the country will be thinking about the effect on us all of the increase in the price of oil and gas as a result of a war in Ukraine. We will continue to do everything we can to help people to abate the cost, to support people through councils, through all the funds that we're giving, the reduction in council tax, Mr. Speaker. But the best thing that we can do is ensure that people are in good, well-paying jobs, and that is in that we are certainly succeeding. But in the medium and the long term, we've got to have more self-reliance in this country on our own energy supplies. And that is what this government is also committed to building.
Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Mr. Speaker, one of the most important economic sanctions we can take against Russia is by freezing its sovereign debt. Will my right honourable friend confirm that the bill proposed on Monday on economic crime will include powers to do so?
Mr. Speaker, we're taking the most powerful measures against Russia and the Russian economy that have ever been taken. I think probably the most powerful ever taken by any country. And Russia will no longer be able to raise any sovereign debt on UK markets.
Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Prime Minister what support we will be providing Ukrainian citizens settled in the UK who wish to reunite with their family members still residing in Ukraine. Many have watched their cities rapidly get caught up in this conflict and are keen to know what more we could be doing to support them to reunite their families.
Mr. Speaker, we will make sure that we support Ukrainian nationals who need to leave to visit to come to this country to meet their relatives. Of course, we'll do that.
Stephen McPartland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud the Prime Minister in this country are leading international support for our friends in Ukraine. Domestically, will the Prime Minister be providing more support for organisations such as our NHS, public sector organisations and businesses that will now be the subject of Russian cyber attacks?
He's right to point to this risk, Mr. Speaker, and I think it's foresighted. We're investing massively in cyber protection. I think another £2.6 billion we're putting in. I think in the last few years we've tackled more than 3,000 cyber attacks. It is a risk. It's a risk that I'm afraid we must run in the cause of freedom.
Matt Robert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to offer my wholehearted support for much tougher sanctions against President Putin and his dreadful regime. Mr. Speaker, as the honourable gentleman from Lockerbie mentioned earlier, there are many historic Ukrainian communities in Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and indeed I would like to commend the work of the Reading Ukrainian Centre. I would like to ask the Prime Minister what additional support can the government give to these very valuable community groups and centres around the country who offer such support to families, friends, relatives, both in the UK and in the Ukraine.
I think, Mr. Speaker, perhaps the most important thing we can do for the Ukrainian community in this country is thank them, recognise them for everything that they've done for us in the last decades. They've been an amazing addition to the UK economy, to our cultural and artistic life.
John Barron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The House is united in its condemnation, but I suggest to the Prime Minister that the lessons to be addressed from this affair started with the invasion of Georgia, Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008 and not 2014. And given, many of us across the House have been warning about Russia, and yet the response has been weak. Does the Prime Minister accept that as we enter the battle for democracy globally, we have got to understand that the sooner you square up to the playground bully, the better, and that we adequately support our hard and soft power to do that?
Yes.
Yes, he is quite right, and I know that by soft power he's thinking also of the British Council, which can have such a wonderful beneficial effect across Russia, and I've seen its work across Russia. But Mr. Speaker, he's right about standing up to the playground bully. We should have done it ages ago. I think the scales have fallen from the eyes of many of our friends and partners.
Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. In an earlier response, the Prime Minister suggested that this country would welcome people who were reuniting with family here. I have a constituent who's Ukrainian, but a British citizen who's trying to bring her mother from Ukraine, but being turned down because she is over 18. Her mother is on her own, has no family, so naturally she's frightened. So will we see a change in the Home Office to enable British citizens who are Ukrainian to bring their vulnerable family here?
Yes, I thank her very much. I think I read out a helpline number in the House on Tuesday. I don't have it again. There is a number both in Lviv and in this country. But if she could do me the favour and send me the details, well, I'll take them up.
Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend my honourable friend and his ministers for the firm stance they're taking? None of us know where or what Mr. Putin's longer-term aims are. If Ukraine falls, and I fear it might, his covetous eye might land on the Baltic states and other vulnerable countries. Can my right honourable friend reassure NATO members that if one Russian boot lands on NATO soil, military force will be met by military force?
Yes, and what is so encouraging, Mr. Speaker, is that the whole House understands the vital importance of that Article 5 guarantee that we make to every one of the 30 members of NATO.
Tony Lloyd. Sir Tony.
The Prime Minister quite rightly pits this as being a battle between the party of war and those who support international law. There is only one lawful government in Ukraine. That's the government of President Zelensky. If they are forced to move, forced possibly into exile in the short run or the longer run, will the Prime Minister state very clearly that we will make sure they can be a functional and effective government wherever they operate from?
It's a very important point that he raises. I'm grateful, and that's why in our discussions with President Zelensky, we are seeing what we can do to give them the practical support that they need to continue.
Robert Jenner.
The City of London is a global asset whose enduring success doesn't rest on dirty money. It rests on a commitment to excellence and on the adherence with the rule of law. So it's right that we now use that as a way to show global leadership. Can I encourage my right honourable friend to sanction all of the remaining Russian banks, to sanction the executives associated with them, and I notice that many are resigning today, to publish a further list of individuals, resident in this country or otherwise, to be sanctioned, and to redouble his excellent efforts to suspend Russia from SWIFT as the single most effective immediate step that the West could do to put pressure on Vladimir Putin.
I thank him very much. I thank him particularly for his important testimonial to the City of London, whose work should not be sullied, Mr. Speaker, by association with ill-gotten Russian money. But the programme that he set out for sanctions is exactly the right one, and the one the government is following.
Mike King.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Will the Prime Minister reiterate that our quarrel is not with the Russian people? It is with their leader, Vladimir Putin, and he has committed a very, very grave error.
He is so right, and I know that that is what the House thinks. We admire the Russian people. Our links to the Russian people go back to the time when we stood shoulder to shoulder to fight fascism with the Russian people. Russia's contribution to culture, to arts, literature, is to music unparalleled. It is an extraordinary country, and nothing that we do or say should obscure that.
Shrubberley.
Winston Churchill created the Council of Europe as a bastion against fascism and communism. And since the fall of communism, Russia has set great importance by its membership as a fig leaf of respectability. Every time our Conservative group has tried to get them expelled, we've been foiled by Russian gold. Will the Prime Minister now instruct his ambassador on the Council of Europe to move for the immediate expulsion of Russia from the Council of Europe so there is no place for gangsters in the halls of civilised nations?
Yes, I think eloquently put, Mr. Speaker, and he's dead right. And I think that my honourable friend for Henley made the point the other day, and I certainly, who's on the Council of Europe, and I certainly agree with that.
Geraint Davis.
Mr. Speaker, so many Russians today see the attack on Ukraine as they would see an attack of their father on their mother, because there's such intimate family relationships between these two groups. And today, thousands of Russians are protesting in cities against their domestic law, against this awful war. Will he provide them with his support? Will he amplify their support to help reduce the support, any support there is for this ridiculous war, and also provide sanction and safe haven for people, refugees, including troops who may want to re-engage, the troops outside of Ukraine, so they can re-engage, so we can win this war at home and abroad?
He makes a series of extremely important observations, and yes, I think it's vital that we get the message across to the whole of Russia about what is really going on. They're being lied to day after day, and I think that his point about supporting troops who need temporary exile, as it were, is a very good one.
Peter Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for yet again coming to House to keep us informed and for his leadership in this crisis. He was right to provide military aid to Ukraine, but the Ukrainian ambassador did ask for our support in a no-fly zone today. In his answer earlier, I think the Prime Minister was keeping that option open. Is that correct?
Yeah. I think it's pretty clear to the House, Mr. Speaker, that we're trying to keep all our options open on this front. Some of them, frankly, may be more practicable than others, and I think we must also have a dose of realism about what we can do on the military front. But we will keep all things under review.
Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Speaker, many of the residents in my constituency come from a number of the countries on the eastern flank and still have relatives living there. Obviously, like us, they will be deeply concerned about the humanitarian impact of the crisis. So, what steps is the government taking to prepare for the humanitarian issues? And with the 1,000 troops on standby to help with humanitarian assistance, will they now be deployed?
I think she raises a very important point, and what we're seeing now, tragically, is people moving west out of Kyiv, columns of traffic, as I'm sure the House knows. We are people already moving into southeastern Poland. There is going to be an influx, as I said to the President of Poland, the Prime Minister of Poland as well. We're there to help.
Laura Trott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister for his statement today and for his strong package of sanctions. I want to ask him about preventing sexual violence in conflict. In November last year, we issued a strong statement which said that the use of sexual violence as a weapon in conflict is a red line akin to the use of chemical weapons. Will he reaffirm that commitment today, and will he send a strong message to Russia that the international community will not tolerate the use of sexual violence in conflict?
Yes, and I thank her for all the work that she's done on that issue. It's something that the UK government has campaigned on for a long time. I mean, indeed, raised the issue very greatly in public international consciousness. I think it should be treated as a war crime like any other, and people who perpetrate sexual violence in conflict can expect to be tried in those tribunals.
John Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In seeking to redraw the boundaries of Europe through bloodshed, Putin has attacked not only the Ukraine but all of us, and we stand with the Ukraine in standing for the rule of law. I welcome the sanctions that he's announced, but I was confused by his response on Russian disinformation, which he seemed to imply would be addressed by the online safety bill. That is many, many, many months away. Russian disinformation is organised, their bots are state-sponsored. What steps will he take to address them?
I thank her. We've got and she raised a good point, but we've got, what we're doing is a massive, positive Stratcoms campaign in Russian, in Ukrainian, to make sure that people get the truth and they hear the truth.
Adam Holloway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we've noticed this afternoon, virtually everyone in this House has supported the efforts towards resistance over the last few months and in these days. I imagine the House will also support the very different sort of warfare under occupation over the coming months and possibly years. But the House will also have noticed the marvellous way the Prime Minister has spoken directly to the Russian people today. And I hope that he will bear in mind that at the moment public opinion in Russia is rather different. That does underline the importance of accurate information.
Prime Minister.
Yes. He is quite right, and I thank him. He's a distinguished former soldier, and he knows that truth is the first casualty. We have to make sure that we are telling people exactly what is going on, and to the best of my knowledge at the moment, the Ukrainians are resisting much more strongly than some people had thought that they would. Who knows how long they can keep going? Let's hope they can, and let's encourage them to do so. But, Mr. Speaker, let's get the message out as well. I think that is our job.
Chris Bryan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is absolutely right. We equivocated shamelessly after Crimea. We were spineless. We must not be spineless now, because what will inevitably happen is either the Baltic states, one of the members of NATO, or perhaps Sweden or Finland will feel the wrath of Putin next. And that will mean British action. Don't we need to try and set in train now a process whereby Putin himself ends up in the dock in a court? Norman Burkitt said, who was the alternate British judge at Nuremberg, said at Nuremberg, initiating a war of aggression is not only an international crime, it is the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole. He must be brought to a court of law and end his days in prison, mustn't he?
Mr. Speaker, I think one of the most fascinating things about what Putin is doing is how close an analogy there is between his actions and those of Slobodan Milosevic. Exactly the same nonsense being peddled about the mystical union between Kosovo and Belgrade as between Kiev and Moscow. Exactly the same aggression, and remember that Slobodan Milosevic died on trial.
Sorry. Mark Harper.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the package of sanctions set out by the Prime Minister and the fact that he's confirmed more will come. If they are to be successful at punishing President Putin for what he has done to date and deterring him from going further and attacking our NATO partners, they must be sustained. And if they're to be sustained, we must be honest with the British people that there is going to be a cost for them. We are going to have to pay an economic cost, but it's a cost we must pay, and it pales into insignificance compared to the cost of the people of Ukraine.
Yes, and not only is that true, Mr. Speaker, but the opportunity and the reward for success and being strong is huge. Because if this should end, Mr. Speaker, with the rejection of aggression and the rejection of the Putin regime's view of the world, then that would be a massive, massive benefit, and an economic benefit as well, to the whole world.
Chamberlain.
Mr Speaker. Up until May 2021, Valentina Yakovleva was my constituent. She resided in Scotland for 20 years with her daughter and her family. But due to an initial error in an application, she eventually exhausted appeals and was deported with 2 COVID jags last year. Now that 71-year-old is sheltering in a subway. In response to the Honourable Member for Central Ayrshire, who's no longer in her place, I would reiterate, does the Prime Minister agree with me that as we face a likely refugee crisis, the UK must be doing all it can to extract individuals who have immediate family relatives in the UK, and urge for support for this case?
Yes. Again, I thank her very much for drawing the case to my attention. If she sends me the details, I'll be happy to make sure it's properly taken up by the Home Office.
Can I just say, those who didn't get in, we have got a list for next time, because this will definitely not be the end. OK, let people leave before I come to the adjournment. You ready? Go for it. Yeah.
I beg to move this House to now adjourn.
The question is this House to now adjourn. Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We were told this week by the Prime Minister that the worst of COVID was over, and we are moving from responding to COVID as a crisis to something that we will be living with in the long term. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I hope, and I think that we all hope, that the Government's assessment is right, that after 2 long years of sacrifice, the worst is over. But this adjournment debate, granted before last week's recess, is also timely, because missing from the Prime Minister's statement on Monday was something very important, and that was how we deal with long COVID. In fact, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister didn't comment on long COVID at all. He talked about Omicron as being a less severe variant, and he said that COVID should now be treated like the flu. But this overlooks the fact that the debilitating symptoms of long COVID are not impacted by the severity of someone's initial COVID symptoms. You can have very mild COVID symptoms initially, but be left with an endless illness, stopping you from carrying out just the most basic activities. And that is one of the reasons why my party want everyone to continue to have access to free testing. The fight against COVID isn't over just because we want to appease backbenchers. But, Mr Speaker, it isn't really possible, Madam Deputy Speaker, it isn't really possible to describe long COVID. But doctors now think that it is caused by somebody having an ongoing immune response to COVID long after the virus has left their body. And what this looks like differs from person to person. There are 150 possible symptoms, with each person having a unique combination of these. The most commonly reported symptom is fatigue, then shortness of breath, loss of smell, difficulty concentrating and aching muscles. But symptoms can also include vertigo, fever, vomiting and diarrhoea, and those name just a few. Long COVID is also relapsing remitting, meaning that symptoms can come and go with very little warning. In short, it's complicated. But what we do know about long COVID is that it is impacting a vast amount of people. According to the Office for National Statistics, in the 4 weeks before the 2nd of January, 1.3 million people across the UK had long COVID. And considering the spread of Omicron didn't peak until 30th December, the actual number suffering today is likely to be higher. Tackling long COVID is a challenge, and one that we must take on as much as tackling COVID itself. I appreciate when I applied for this debate, I caused a little confusion. Why was a Scottish MP wanting to talk about a health condition when the care of our constituents is under the remit of the Scottish Government? And in some ways they are right. And it would be remiss of me not to pay tribute to the hard work of my friend, the Member of the Scottish Parliament for Edinburgh West, who has been leading the way on getting health and social care support for long COVID sufferers in Scotland. And I know his current calls for proper care pathways, specialist clinics and support from trained district nurses will hugely benefit my constituents and others. But treatment, Madam Deputy Speaker, is only half the battle. The focus of this debate today is how long COVID affects someone's ability to work and what support they need as a result. Because if we are now living with COVID, we are now also living with long COVID. We've learned a lot about this disease in the past 2 years. There was so little understanding for those people who caught COVID in those very early days, and no understanding that their symptoms could last. But they have lasted, and for that first cohort of sufferers, they have lasted for nearly 2 years. At first, it might have been understandable to think that they just need to wait it out for their health to return to normal, but we cannot say that now. It would be completely disingenuous, for the symptoms are now the reality of their daily lives. Madam Deputy Speaker, I've already mentioned that there are over 150 symptoms associated with long COVID, and the medical profession is still starting to grapple with it, and most people don't understand it much at all. And sadly, a lack of understanding is causing, as it so often does, a stigma. A stigma which is all too well known by sufferers of other diseases such as ME. Like long COVID, fatigue is a common symptom of ME, and it too comes and goes. And when preparing for this debate, I spoke to representatives from Action for ME who have extensive experience with the problems facing those who describe fatigue as their primary symptom. And what they told me is that people with ME face a significant stigma, face being told that their illness doesn't exist, or that they should just learn to push through. They have also told me that they see the same narrative and the same problems being reported for hundreds of thousands who have severe fatigue as a result of long COVID. Indeed, Action for ME has had to close its helpline and its waiting list because it has seen such a surge in people contacting them, and I can't believe that that is not unrelated to long COVID. Madam Deputy Speaker, this leaves thousands of people suffering from an illness which may well make it hard for them to work, but where their colleagues and their employers do not necessarily believe that there is anything wrong with them. How do you explain an absence or ask for support in the face of being told that you are fabricating your debilitating symptoms? A better definition, guidance for employers and a government-led campaign to boost awareness and understanding would go a very long way towards changing those attitudes to long COVID. This problem is exacerbated by those people who don't have a formal diagnosis of long COVID to fall back on. The government's working definition of long COVID is a condition where symptoms cannot be diagnosed as being from anything else but the after-effect of a COVID infection. But there is a problem. Not all sufferers of long COVID have had a positive test result for COVID. For the past 18 months, COVID tests have become a part of daily life for most of us. But those who got COVID in the first months of the pandemic were ill without ever being tested because the tests simply did not exist at that time. And this is a huge problem in a system where support, either from employers or from the DWP, requires proof. And there is a future problem here too, one that I've already referred to and perhaps the government would like to preempt. The Prime Minister announced on Monday that free testing will end in just 5 weeks' time, and that means that more people will have COVID and might then have long COVID without that formal diagnosis. It would be a small but vital change to make sure that the diagnosis does not rely on a positive test result being on someone's NHS record. They happily give way.
Extremely grateful to her. I just wonder whether antibody testing might achieve the aim that she intends rather than antigen testing, which is what we're currently doing.
Thank you, Member, for the intervention. I would accept either testing, but what I'm also asking for is that actually proof of a positive test doesn't need to be a requirement for a diagnosis of long COVID. Thank you. Of course, it would be better for many reasons to just keep testing everyone, but failing this, I would ask the Minister to speak with his colleagues in the Department of Health about how long COVID can be diagnosed without a test result, and to commit to making sure it is not required for recognition of the disease by his own department. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm sure that in his remarks, the Minister will tell me there is no evidence of a problem of long COVID in keeping people in work, but that is because the information is not being collected. As I've said, 1.3 million people have long COVID, and of those, almost 2/3 report an impact on their ability to carry out their daily lives. It's logical to assume that this includes employment, getting up, commuting, concentrating, completing a full day of work. And I would urge the Minister and the Department to urgently collect the data needed to find out the extent to which people with long COVID are struggling at work. I would also urge him to urgently provide guidance to employers as to how they can support employees with long COVID. At the very least, affected staff need understanding, but beyond this, employers need to know what reasonable adjustments are appropriate, how to support staff who are on long-term sick leave, and how to adjust their business practices to function in the face of increased absences. I have some experience. I worked for a time in human resources and have some experience of dealing with issues that arise as a result of those with long-term health conditions. And I have great sympathy for those in human resources who are tackling this problem now on behalf of their employers. This problem may be larger for some employers than others, particularly given the number of key workers who caught COVID by working on the front line during the first waves of the pandemic. And I have been written to by many constituents in this position. To mention just one, she was working as a healthcare support worker in the first wave of the pandemic when she caught COVID from a patient. She has been unable, as a result of long COVID, to return to work. Her employer, the local council, want to help, but they didn't know what was best to do. And there will be thousands of employees in the same position all around the country. They need guidance from the DWP as to the condition and what support they can and should be expected to be giving. And I'm told that in this regard it would be helpful if long COVID was classified as an occupational disease, and I would therefore ask the Minister to use his time today to advise whether that is under consideration and then to bring that guidance forward as a matter of urgency. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm sure the Minister will agree with me in hoping that with the right support and guidance that most people experiencing long COVID will be able to stay in their jobs, to keep working, to keep earning, to continue in their careers. But sadly that won't be the case for everybody. There will be those who cannot work as much as they used to or who cannot work at all. And that is where our social security system steps up. The Minister knows this. It is already official government guidance that for anyone with a disability or long-term health condition, including long COVID, there is strong financial safety net. It then goes on to list available support as statutory sick pay, universal credit and personal independent payments. But as is so often the case with benefits, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is not that easy. Applying for benefits is complicated. There are a lot of forms, a lot of boxes to tick, a lot of assessments. When you have a debilitating condition like long COVID or like one of the other relapsing remitting diseases I've already mentioned, you might not be able to sit and complete a 30-page form in one go, or even in the course of a week or two. Research by the MS Society has shown that a third of people with MS thought 4 weeks was not enough time to complete forms, but that the majority of applicants did not know that they could request a 2-week extension. A simple solution to this is simply extend the time allowed to complete forms. There is no incentive for claimants to take excessive time because they want to get the support that they need. Meanwhile, it uses up DWP resources, requiring people to request extensions.
Good afternoon.
Setting up the time.
The Russian military has begun a brutal assault on the people of Ukraine. Without provocation, without justification, without necessity, this is a premeditated attack. Vladimir Putin has been planning this for months, as we've been saying all along. He moved more than 175,000 troops, military equipment and positions along the Ukrainian border. He moved blood supplies into position and built a field hospital, which tells you all you need to know about his intentions all along. He rejected every good faith effort the United States and our allies and partners made to address our mutual security concerns through dialogue to avoid needless conflict and avert human suffering. For weeks, we have been warning that this would happen. And now, it's unfolding largely as we predicted. In the past week, we've seen shelling increase in the Donbass, a region in eastern Ukraine controlled by Russian-backed separatists. The Russian government has perpetrated cyber attacks against Ukraine. We saw a staged political theater in Moscow, outlandish and baseless claims that Ukraine was about to invade and launch a war against Russia, that Ukraine was prepared to use chemical weapons, that Ukraine committed a genocide. Without any evidence, we saw a flagrant violation of international law in attempting to unilaterally create 2 new so-called republics on sovereign Ukrainian territory. And at the very moment that the United Nations Security Council was meeting to stand up for Ukraine's sovereignty, to stave off invasion, Putin declared his war. Within moments, missile strikes began to fall on historic cities across Ukraine. Then came the air raids, followed by tanks and troops rolling in. We've been transparent with the world. We've shared declassified evidence about Russia's plans and cyber attacks and false pretexts so that there could be no confusion or cover-up about what Putin was doing. Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences. Today, I'm authorizing additional strong sanctions and new limitations on what can be exported to Russia. This is going to impose severe cost on the Russian economy, both immediately and over time. We have purposely designed these sanctions to maximize the long-term impact on Russia and to minimize the impact on the United States and our allies. And I want to be clear, the United States is not doing this alone. For months, we've been building a coalition of partners representing well more than half the global economy. 27 members of the European Union, including France, Germany, Italy, as well as the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and many others, to amplify the joint impact of our response. I just spoke with the G7 leaders this morning, and we're in full and total agreement. We will limit Russia's ability to do business in dollars, euros, pounds, and yen to be part of the global economy. We'll limit their ability to do that. We're going to stunt the ability to finance and grow the Russian military. We're going to impose major, and we're going to impair their ability to compete in high-tech 21st century economy. We've already seen the impact of our actions on Russia's currency and the ruble, which early today hit its weakest level ever in history. The Russian stock market plunged today. The Russian government borrowing rate spiked by over 15%. In today's actions, we've now sanctioned Russian banks that together hold around $1 trillion in assets. We've cut off Russia's largest bank, a bank that holds more than 1/3 of Russia's banking assets by itself, cut it off from the U.S. financial system. And today, we're also blocking 4 more major banks. That means every asset they have in America will be frozen. This includes VTB, the second largest bank in Russia, which has $250 billion in assets. As promised, we're also adding the names to the list of Russian elites and their family members that we're sanctioning as well. As I said on Tuesday, these are people who personally gain from the Kremlin's policies, and they should share in the pain. We will keep up this drumbeat of those designations against corrupt billionaires in the days ahead. On Tuesday, we stopped the Russian government from raising money from U.S. or European investors. Now we're going to apply the same restrictions to Russia's largest state-owned enterprises, companies with assets that exceed $1.4 trillion. Some of the most powerful impacts of our actions will come over time as we squeeze Russia's access to finances and technology for strategic sectors of its economy and degrade its industrial capacity for years to come. Between our actions and those of our allies and partners, we estimate that we'll cut off more than half of Russia's high-tech imports. It will strike a blow to their ability to continue to modernize their military. It will degrade their aerospace industry, including their space program. It will hurt their ability to build ships, reducing their ability to compete economically. And it will be a major hit to Putin's long-term strategic ambitions. And we're preparing to do more. In addition to the economic penalties we're imposing, we're also taking steps to defend our NATO allies, particularly in the East. Tomorrow, NATO will convene a summit. We'll be there to bring together the leaders of 30 allied nations and close partners to affirm our solidarity and to map out the next steps we will take to further strengthen all aspects of our NATO alliance. Although we provided over $650 million in defensive assistance to Ukraine just this last year, let me say it again. Our forces are not and will not be engaged in the conflict with Russia in Ukraine. Our forces are not going to Europe to fight in Ukraine, but to defend our NATO allies and reassure those allies in the East. As I made crystal clear, the United States will defend every inch of NATO territory with the full force of American power. And the good news is, NATO is more united and more determined than ever. There is no doubt that the United States and every NATO ally will meet our Article 5 commitments, which says that an attack on one is an attack on all. Over the past few weeks, I ordered thousands of additional forces to Germany and Poland as part of our commitment to NATO. On Tuesday, in response to Russia's aggressive action, including its troop presence in Belarus and the Black Sea, I've authorized the deployment of ground and air forces already stationed in Europe to NATO's eastern flank allies, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Romania. Our allies have also been stepping up, adding the other allies, the rest of NATO, adding their own forces and capabilities to ensure collective defense. And today, within hours of Russia's unleashing its assault, NATO came together and authorized and activated an activation of response plans. This will enable NATO's high readiness forces to deploy and when and where they are needed to protect our NATO allies on the eastern boundaries of Europe. And now I'm authorizing additional U.S. force capabilities to deploy to Germany as part of NATO's response, including some of the U.S.-based forces that the Department of Defense placed on standby weeks ago. I've also spoken with Defense Secretary Austin and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, about preparations for additional moves should they become necessary to protect our NATO allies and support the greatest military alliance in the history of the world, NATO. As we respond, my administration is using the tools, every tool at its disposal, to protect American families and businesses from rising prices at the gas pump. You know, we're taking active steps to bring down the cost, and American oil and gas companies should not exploit this moment to hike their prices to raise profits. You know, in our sanctions package, we specifically designed to allow energy payments to continue. We are closely monitoring energy supplies for any disruption. We've been coordinating with major oil producing and consuming countries toward our common interest to secure global energy supplies. We are actively working with countries around the world to elevate collective release from the strategic petroleum reserves of major energy consuming countries. And the United States will release additional barrels of oil as conditions warrant. I know this is hard and that Americans are already hurting. I will do everything in my power to limit the pain the American people are feeling at the gas pump. This is critical to me. But this aggression cannot go unanswered. If it did, the consequences for America would be much worse. America stands up to bullies. We stand up for freedom. This is who we are. Let me also repeat the warning I made last week. If Russia pursues cyber attacks against our companies, our critical infrastructure, we are prepared to respond. For months, we've been working closely with the private sector to harden us, sharpen our ability to respond to Russian cyber attacks as well. I spoke last night to President Zelensky of Ukraine, and I assured him that the United States, together with our allies and partners in Europe, will support the Ukrainian people as they defend their country. We'll provide humanitarian relief to ease their suffering. And in the early days of this conflict, Russia propaganda outlets will keep trying to hide the truth and claim success for its military operation against a made-up threat. But history has shown, time and again, how swift gains in territory eventually give way to grinding occupations, acts of mass civil disobedience, and strategic dead ends. The next few weeks and months will be hard on the people of Ukraine. Putin has unleashed a great pain on them, but the Ukrainian people have known 30 years of independence. And they have repeatedly shown that they will not tolerate anyone who tries to take their country backwards. This is a dangerous moment for all of Europe, for the freedom around the world. Putin has committed an assault on the very principles that uphold the global peace. But now, the entire world sees clearly what Putin and his Kremlin allies are really all about. This was never about a genuine security concerns on their part. It was always about naked aggression, about Putin's desire for empire by any means necessary, by bullying Russia's neighbors through coercion and corruption, by changing borders by force, and ultimately by choosing a war without a cause. Putin's actions betray his sinister vision for the future of our world, one where nations take what they want by force. But it is a vision that the United States and freedom-loving nations everywhere will oppose with every tool of our considerable power. The United States and our allies and partners will emerge from this stronger, more united, more determined, and more purposeful. And Putin's aggression against Ukraine will end up costing Russia dearly, economically and strategically. We will make sure of that. Putin will be a pariah on the international stage. Any nation that countenances Russia's naked aggression against Ukraine will be stained by association. When the history of this era is written, Putin's choice to make a totally unjustifiable war on Ukraine will have left Russia weaker and the rest of the world stronger. Liberty, democracy, human dignity, these are the forces far more powerful than fear and oppression. They cannot be extinguished by tyrants like Putin and his armies. They cannot be erased by from people's hearts and hopes by any amount of violence and intimidation. They endure. In the contest between democracy and autocracy, between sovereignty and subjugation, make no mistake, freedom will prevail. God bless the people of a free and democratic Ukraine, and may God protect our troops.
Mr. President.
Associated Press, Zeke.
Speak with President Putin at this point, and what interactions have you had with the Russian government?
I heard the first part. Do I have any plans to speak with Putin at this point, and what?
What communications have you had with the Kremlin as far as military operations in Ukraine and making sure this does not spiral into a larger conflict?
Well, it's a large conflict already. The way we're going to ensure it's not going to aspire to a larger conflict is by providing all the forces needed in the Eastern European nations that are members of NATO. NATO is more united than it's ever been, and I have no plans to talk with Putin. Wall Street Journal, Tarina.
Mr. President, you didn't mention SWIFT in your sanctions that you announced. Is there a reason why the U.S. Isn't doing that? Is there a disagreement among allies regarding SWIFT and whether Russia should be allowed to be a part of it?
The sanctions that we've proposed on all their banks have of equal consequence, maybe more consequence than SWIFT, number one. Number two, it is always an option, but right now that's not the position that the rest of Europe wishes to take. Cecilia Vega, ABC.
Sir, sanctions clearly have not been enough to deter Vladimir Putin to this point. What is going to stop him? How and when does this end? And do you see him trying to go beyond Ukraine? And a second question I'll just give to you now. This statement that he gave last night, the threat that he gave, the West will face consequences greater than any you have faced in history. Is he threatening a nuclear strike?
I have no idea what he's threatening. I know what he has done, number one. And number two, no one expected the sanctions to prevent anything from happening. It has to show, this is going to take time, and we have to show resolve so he knows what's coming. And so the people of Russia know what he's brought on them. That's what this is all about. This is going to take time. It's not going to occur. He's going to say, oh my God, these sanctions are coming, I'm going to stand down. He's going to test the resolve of the West to see if we stay together, and we will. We will, and it will impose significant costs on him.
Will he go beyond Ukraine, sir? Do you see him going beyond?
Yes.
Two topics, just really quick. First, markets are down and gas prices are up. I know you always stress the difference between Wall Street and Main Street, but everybody seems to be in for some economic pain. How economically painful is it going to get for people in this country? And I do have one more question.
First of all, there's no doubt that when a major nuclear power attacks and invades another country, that the world is going to respond, and markets can respond all over the world. So there's no doubt about that, number one. Number two, the notion that this is going to last for a long time is highly unlikely as long as we continue to stay resolved in imposing the sanctions we're going to impose on Russia, period. What's the next question? I'm sorry.
The next question is, did you underestimate Putin, and would you still describe him the way that you did in the summer as a worthy adversary?
At the time, he was, I made it clear, as an adversary, and I said he was worthy. I didn't underestimate him. And I've read most of everything he's written. Did you read the, I shouldn't, I'm not being a wise guy. You heard the speech he made, almost an hour's worth of speeches, why he was going into Ukraine. He has much larger ambitions in Ukraine. He wants to, in fact, reestablish the former Soviet Union. That's what this is about. And I think that his ambitions are completely contrary to the place where the rest of the world has arrived.
You're confident that these devastating sanctions are going to be as devastating as Russian missiles and bullets and tanks?
Yes, Russian bullets, missiles, and tanks in Ukraine. Yes, I am.
Thank you, President Biden. If sanctions cannot stop President Putin, what penalty can?
I didn't say sanctions couldn't stop him.
You've been talking about the threat of these sanctions for several weeks now.
Yes, but the threat of the sanctions and imposing the sanctions and seeing the effect of the sanctions are two different things. They're two different things. And he's going to begin to see the effect of the sanctions.
And what will that do? How will that change his mindset here, given he's attacking Ukraine
Because it will so weaken his country that he'll have to make a very, very difficult choice as to whether to continue to move toward being a second-rate power or, in fact, respond.
You said in recent weeks that big nations cannot bluff when it comes to something like this. You recently said that the idea of personally sanctioning President Putin was on the table. Is that a step that you're prepared to take? And if not,
it's not a bluff, it's on the table.
Sanctioning President Putin?
Yes.
Why not sanction him today, sir? Mr. President? Why not sanction him today, sir?
Mr. President, if I can, you detailed some severe and swift new sanctions today and said the impact it will have over time. But given the full-scale invasion, given that you're not pursuing disconnecting Russia from what's called SWIFT, the international banking system, or other sanctions at your disposal, respectfully, sir, what more are you waiting for?
Specifically, with the sanctions we've imposed exceed SWIFT. The sanctions we imposed exceed anything that's ever been done. The sanctions we imposed have generated 2/3 of the world joining us. They are profound sanctions. Let's have a conversation in another month or so to see if they're working. Yes.
Can I ask you about Zelensky? Sir, you spoke to Vladimir Zelensky yesterday, sir.
What's the risk that we are watching the beginning of another Cold War, and is there now a complete rupture in U.S. and Russian relations?
There is a complete rupture right now in U.S.-Russian relations if they continue on this path that they're on. And in terms of a Cold War, that depends. You have the vast majority of the rest of the world in total opposition to what he's doing, from Asia to South America to Europe to around the world. And so it's going to be a cold day for Russia. The idea, you don't see a whole lot of people coming to his defense.
And are you, if I could follow up, sir, are you urging China to help isolate Russia? Are you urging China to help isolate Russia?
I'm not prepared to comment on that at the moment. Wait, no. Yeah. No. He's had his hand up a long time.
Thank you, Mr. President. How concerned are you that Putin wants to go beyond Ukraine into other countries, and the U.S. will have to get involved if he moves into NATO countries?
Well, if he did move into NATO countries, he will be involved. We will be involved. The only thing that I'm convinced of is if we don't stop now, he'll be emboldened. If we don't move against him now with these significant sanctions, he will be emboldened. And look, well, anyway.
Can you talk anything more about your conversation? Mr. President.
Why not sanction Putin directly today? Defense partner for the
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Sir, India, which is a major defense partner of the United States, is India fully with you on the issue of Ukraine and Russia?
Does the Defense Department of the United States?
So India is one of your major defense partners. Is India fully in sync with the United States on Russia?
We're in consultation with India today. We haven't resolved that completely.
One more question.
Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you.
Mr. President.